Hello everyone, and welcome to the EHESS Spring Talks 2022. It is my privilege and pleasure to introduce Sebastian Veg, who is Professor in Intellectual History of Modern and Contemporary China at EHESS, translated into English as School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris. Bonjour from Paris. I happen also to have been animating a seminar for numerous years in this institution, and so I'm very glad to be here again. And I also supervise some doctoral students in this institution, although I've been a professor at Collège de France since 2008 on the chair of Chinese intellectual history. So you can tell that my field of interest is very close to that of Sebastian. So Sebastian's areas of research include the history of intellectuals and social movements, the history of publications and public spheres, as well as the recent history of Hong Kong. He was posted to the French Center for Research on Contemporary China in Hong Kong from 2006 to 2015, and also taught at the University of Hong Kong, where he is an honorary professor. He has focused on Chinese intellectuals from May 4th to the present, and his publications include an annotated French translation of Lu Xun's short stories and prose poems, published at Retour in 2015. His latest monograph is Minjian, The Rise of China's Grassroots Intellectuals, published by Columbia University Press in 2019. He also contributed to the volume Pensée en Chine, edited in French by myself at Gallimard just last year, 2021, where his contribution bore also on contemporary Chinese intellectuals. So it's now our pleasure to listen to Sebastian Veg's talk.
Many thanks, Anne. Thank you for your kind introduction, and especially for taking time out of your very busy schedule to listen to my ramblings. As Anne also just mentioned, she holds the chair of intellectual history at the Collège de France, which means that she has so many more centuries of intellectuals to attend to than I do, that I feel positively guilty at keeping her from her desk for more than 2 hours. But anyway, it's a great privilege to hear her views on the short but eventful century in which our interests overlap, and I look forward to our discussion. Let me begin by saying a few words about how I came to work on this topic. It's probably fair to say that I experienced a prolonged hesitation between literature and history. I wrote 2 master's theses, one on bars and underground publics in the late years of the East German state, which I researched just as the archives were opening up in the late 1990s, whereas the other one focused on the themes of feasting and partying in the literature of interwar Europe. After spending a few years in China, I finally decided to write a PhD dissertation on literary constructions of democracy and revolution in China, which also incorporated archival material into a mainly literary argument. So while my training skewed towards literature, the questions I was interested in were more closely connected to intellectual and cultural history than to the theoretical issues that have somewhat taken over literary and cultural studies in recent years. And this is why, making use of the privilege that this unique institution allows us, I chose the name Intellectual History of Modern and Contemporary China as the title of my professorship here. Having said that, this talk will not be an apology for any specific type of disciplinary approach, but rather an opportunity to share some questions and doubts about intellectual history and its intersection with some of its neighboring fields. So this talk uses the title of a graduate seminar I offered in the spring of 2020, which was of course held entirely online. And as much of Europe came to a standstill in the midst of the pandemic, it was a quite joyful experience of intellectual exchange. And I particularly want to thank the students and colleagues who joined that seminar and made it so enjoyable. I think this is the right time to start my PowerPoint. Here we go. The study of knowledge, ideas, and their producers undoubtedly has a long tradition, both in China and among foreign sinologists and historians. In Chinese, the notion of 思想史, like many names of modern disciplines, became popular in the late Qing. Liang Qichao, for example, used it at a moment of Hegelian historicism that it shared with the English notion of history of ideas. Critiques of intellectual history since that time have abounded, of course. To quote only three of the main ones, intellectual history was at length criticized or attacked for giving credence to elite idealizations of society, as sustaining a mechanistic understanding of knowledge circulation, the famous impact-response paradigm, and of being complicit with Cold War liberalism or anti-communism, which is particularly relevant in the context of Hong Kong and Taiwan. However, in the aftermath of the methodological turns, social turn, cultural turn, linguistic turn, now the global turn, intellectual history as a discipline has made something of a comeback and has tried to reestablish its legitimacy and specificities. So I will try to reconsider this object in my presentation today by focusing not, of course, on these Hegelian ideas and their march through history, but on the material, social, and cultural conditions of knowledge production and circulation in 20th century China. So I want to start with something a little bit amusing, which is an issue of the journal Daedalus, which was published in 1971, almost exactly 50 years ago. This was volume 100 of this journal published by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, founded in 1846. It came out of a conference in Rome, which was funded by the Ford Foundation, and it is germane to today's discussion for several reasons. The first reason is that the opening article is by Jacques Le Goff, who at that time was directeur d'études at the École pratique des hautes études, the predecessor of the EHESS. He was the editor of the Annales, and he was, of course, a prominent medievalist and historian of mentalité, and about to be appointed president of the 6th section of EPHE, out of which he founded and became the first president of EHESS in 1975. This issue further contains articles by Eric Hobsbawm, François Furet, and on the second page of the table of contents, which is not pictured here, Robert Darnton. So it is a kind of very broadly representative issue of some of the trends and some of the discussions that were taking place in the historical discipline at the time. In particular, Eric Hobsbawm, so still a communist and one of the founding editors of Past and Present, François Furet, at this point no longer a Marxist, but advocating quantitative history in this issue, and to succeed Le Goff in 1977 as president of EHESS, and Robert Darnton in one of his earliest articulations of the sociology of literature. And Benjamin Schwartz, a brief defense of political and intellectual history with specific reference to non-Western cultures. So this issue, I think, is germane to our discussion because it touches on various aspects or various difficulties of the discipline that I want to discuss today. So, of course, it displays in passing, this is a theme I will not have time to develop, but it is certainly an interesting one, and there is a lot of information online about it, of the intellectual and political affinities between American and French social sciences during the Cold War. Funding from the Rockefeller Foundation for the establishment of the EHESS and from the Ford Foundation for this conference, possible anti-communist afterthoughts, as have been pointed out in connection with François Furet's work, but of course also Eric Hobsbawm's presence in this issue. It's also connected to the question of area studies in social sciences, and this idea of promoting this form of area studies that had some connections with North American academia. EHESS emerged as a European Center for Area Studies in this context, although the methodology that was developed here cannot be directly compared, I think, to the American equivalent. So this is the background against which I want to discuss Benjamin Schwartz's article, A Brief Defense of Political and Intellectual History. Benjamin Schwartz engages with several of these strands in his essay, including the definition and critiques of intellectual history, the issues of elite and popular culture, the question of mentalité, which he deals with through a critique of structuralism, and the place of China or Chinese studies in an academic system dominated by Western concepts. He directly confronts critiques of intellectual history as mattering only to a small elite, inherently idealist, or cut off from the social context. So I've excerpted a couple of quotes here. He begins the article by writing, "The English term intellectual history is most unfortunate, since it seems to imply an exclusive concern with the intellect in the narrow sense of the term, and hence also seems to imply an exclusive concern with the history of those called intellectuals. Intellectual history, as we conceive of it, involves the totality of man's conscious life, the life of the intellect, the emotions, the imagination, and every variety of sensibility, and not simply the realm of conceptualization. Furthermore, we are by no means exclusively concerned with the intellectual life of man as a self-subsistent realm, as the so-called history of ideas, but with human consciousness as related to the historic situations in which men find themselves." That's the quote you have up there in the first line. So furthermore, this charge of elitism based on this kind of abstracted vision of ideas relies on what Schwartz deems to be a kind of warped, twisted vision of social history. The notion that the ideas and preoccupations of those who write and leave records are most often of concern only to priests, monks, religious visionaries, scholars, intellectuals, or effete ruling classes is based on what might be called a patronizing humanitarianism. In this view, masses who live in poverty should be properly concerned only with their poverty. So this question of an intellectual history of non-elite texts, of their production and their circulation and their reception, is of course at the heart of this defense of intellectual history. We then come to China. Indeed, one of the barriers to a broadly conceived intellectual history of this type, both in China and elsewhere, has been the facile acceptance of the distinction between folk culture or little culture and high culture. There has been a tendency in the West to contrast the cool, rationalistic Confucianism of the literati to the irrational superstitions and primitive folk religion of the masses. In fact, a closer look reveals that the literati most often shared in the superstitions and magical beliefs of the masses, and were indeed able to provide a kind of rational basis for these beliefs in their highly developed cosmological theories. To a greater or lesser degree, they also shared in and were able to provide rationales for their participation in various aspects of so-called popular religion. On the other hand, popular literature, proverbs, and other more immediate sources of evidence would indicate that the ideas of the so-called high culture circulated widely among the masses. The ideologies of rebellion are by no means simple products of the folk mind. They were most often fashioned by literati or semi-literati, but were of course quite accessible to the masses. So this model, so I will come back to this, which was picked up by Roger Chartier and many times later on, of contesting this division, this dichotomy between folk and elite culture, is formulated here in close connection with the Chinese example. So the last main point, I think, of this text, the question of dealing with the non-Western culture in this area of intellectual history. Schwartz here proceeds to present a critique of structuralism. And of course, in this issue, which is to some extent associated with this French context of structuralism in a complex relationship with the Annales and with the general discussion that's going on here at this time, is also connected in his view to China. So he writes, I have not, however, provided a justification for the particular concern with political and intellectual history in dealing with the non-Western culture in the face of the strong current within the profession to stress objective social scientific history. In his Pensée Sauvage, Lévi-Strauss states that the ultimate goal of the human sciences is not to constitute, but to dissolve man. That is, to dissolve him into the various impersonal structures, biological, societal, anthropological, and so forth, which make up his being. It has been easier for us to impose our models and pre-established structures onto China. The Chinese will not contradict us because we know so little of what they have said. This, I think, is a very enjoyable kind of quotation, which is worth remembering. So he then goes on, I will not go into the detailed critique of Marcel Granet, and he concludes by setting out his program of an intellectual history of China that would be concerned not simply with Chinese thought, but with Chinese thinking and thinking within the framework of their historical situations. So much for Benjamin Schwartz. And I think the arguments to rebut the simplistic critiques of intellectual history are all here in this article that was published 50 years ago. So I will just go back briefly and flesh out some of these ideas that were picked up later, both by Robert Darnton and by Roger Chartier. Robert Darnton, so these articles are very well known, I think, for people who have been working in Western or European intellectual history. They are absolute classics, which both of them, I would say, can be read as a continuation of Benjamin Schwartz's arguments. And I like this idea that, the European historians are actually learning from Benjamin Schwartz, the intellectual historian of China. Robert Darnton sketches out a kind of spectrum of intellectual history, which goes from the very elite kind of history of philosophical systems to and then more an intellectual history of what he calls informal thought, to the social history of ideas, and finally what he calls cultural history, including worldviews and mentalité. Chartier criticizes what he presents as three dichotomies, many of which are connected to the criticism presented by the Annales school against intellectual history. So the dichotomy between elite and popular thought, which is the one we just discussed in connection with Schwartz. The dichotomy of production and reception. He underlines that reception is always also a form of production. Reading a text is a form of rewriting it. Just a quote, a central idea of intellectual history is the relationship of the text to the individual or collective readers who each time construct them. And finally, the dichotomy of reality and representation, the idea that certain texts depict reality directly, whereas others are simply representations. So here, Chartier quotes Bourdieu to say that cognitive structures are also social structures and representations reciprocally are constitutive of social reality. So what matters here is not so much the details, but that I think that intellectual history of modern and contemporary China has an important place in this discussion. So I would like to come to some more recent reflections here, and this is the other main text I will dwell on in this introduction, is Benjamin Ellman's article, The Failures of Contemporary Chinese Intellectual History. So Ellman's starting point is that history has been presented with a very strong critique from what is generally known as postmodernism. He writes, postmodernists have dissolved history, particularly intellectual history, into literature. To that, he responds not by dismissing this challenge, but by saying there is a need to take up the challenge and to rebuild some form of historical methodology. How to rebuild it? Not through Marxism or Mannheim's sociology of knowledge. Intellectual history is not simply a history of the ideas that can be attributed to social classes. That is too mechanistic an approach. Not through the teleology of modernization theory, in which ideas are always leading towards, well, certainly in the Chinese context, the impact of Western theory and the march towards progress and development, nor through functionalism and structuralism. And this theme again resonates with Benjamin Schwartz's theme. So Ellman is distrustful of Foucault and Bourdieu because he believes their theories do not deal adequately with intentionality and human agency. He gives the example of late Ching society, in which he argues that there was no notion of intellectual property or even notion of real economic capital. And so, in his view, applying the idea of cultural capital to late Ching society is quite anachronistic. The domination of commoners by literati elites in the late Qing was much more complex than the scheme that he sees in Bourdieu's theories. So he argues, this is where this quote comes in, that intellectual historians of China have rightly defended their discipline against the reductionist strategies employed by social and economic historians. Accordingly, they appeal to the autonomy of ideas from their historical context. Nevertheless, and here comes the other side of the critique, it is equally misguided to leap to the implausible opposite culturalist fallacy that ideas, values, and cultures alone are determinative in social and economic life, as some recent champions of Pacific Rim neo-Confucianism ideology have suggested. So here he proceeds to present a methodical critique of this idea. Well, first of all, that Chinese intellectual life can be summed up in some idealized form of Confucianism or neo-Confucianism, and that this theory, which was previously presented as an obstacle to modernization, has now become the most valuable asset of a Chinese culture to enter into the dance of modernity. He even writes that Pacific Rim studies are the new Orientalism, with Neo-Confucianism as their guiding ideology. And he gives some examples of what he calls the immense task of integrating China's intellectual with its social, political, and economic history. In particular, he gives the example of the appearance of New Text Confucianism in the late Qianlong era, which he connects with the critique of court corruption. And in this way, he argues that there is a strong connection between socioeconomic roots and the ideological formations. He also discusses the public sphere debate in late imperial China, which was a big historiographical discussion in the 1990s. And he points out that Chinese notions of public are constructed in different contexts than notions of public in other contexts. In particular, the notion of public is connected with kinship groups, whereas, for example, political associations of the gentry are inevitably labeled as private or selfish. So this question of delimiting these areas can't be undertaken without paying close attention to social and economic factors. So what is the answer to all of this? I want to mention this essay by Li Zhenko, which raises a lot of interesting questions, although maybe the answers are still not quite formulated. So Li Zhenko asks whether we can go on the possibility of Chinese thought as global theory, whether we can go beyond the application of Western theory to Eastern contexts. I think this is a valuable question to some extent, but only if it also brings us to question the application, of course, of Marxist concepts favored by mainland Chinese academia to pre-modern Chinese contexts. and also if it brings us to pay attention to the internal pluralism of academic discussion within China. So the kind of globalization of intellectual history should not, which is of course now the hottest new theme, should not lead us to a system in which each country is represented by its kind of preeminent intellectual tradition, because that leads us straight into the stereotypes that we have dealt with in the past. So there's certainly a case to be made for a more global approach to intellectual history, but probably through greater emphasis on the global circulation of knowledge, including translations, transfers, knowledge brokers, networks, as well as reception and reconceptualization, which need to be studied in a less mechanistic manner than previously. So much for my first part. I want to talk a little bit about Chinese intellectuals in the long 20th century. So now we know, of course, that intellectual history is not the history of great men or even the history of great men and women. Nonetheless, there is a need to discuss not individuals, but what is actually meant by this term of intellectuals at different points in the 20th century. So who were the producers and disseminators of knowledge and ideas in modern and contemporary China? A quick note on terminology. So I think the term from which we should start is probably the term of shidafu or shidaifu, the scholar officials or literati whose authority was validated by the imperial examination system until 1905. So they, this kind of ideal type, based on moral authority, which grounded political and epistemic authority, on the idea of taking responsibility, so the famous formulation, 以天下为己任, and the idea of a social conscience for the state and the community, 忧国忧民, and the min should always be there, it's not only 忧国, and the kind of spectrum of roles between advice and dissent that Frederick Wakeman has also detailed in a typology. This model fed into what emerged around the time of 1919, which is the new kind of post-imperial literati. Maybe we can call them that to begin with. So after the imperial examinations had been abolished in 1905, of course, there were still some degree holders who were around, but there were also people who were now educated in modern schools. So how did these people refer to each other? The term that evolved at this point was the term which was one of these reverse loanwords from Japanese. So, well, we can say it first in Japanese, Chishikikaikyu, and then Jushijieji in Chinese, which referred to, basically, this is thought to be a translation or adaptation of the Russian term intelligentsia. The educated knowledge producers at this time came into contact with this notion through texts coming from Russia. In particular, there's a famous lecture given by a Russian writer called Eroshenko in 1922, which was translated by, I believe, Zhou Zuoren, Lu Xun's brother, which is on the Zhishijiji, on the intelligentsia. So this word has a kind of collective dimension. It's not an intellectual as one eminent person. So of course it encompasses this notion of class in a somewhat pre-Marxist, I think, meaning, because when this term arose in the late Meiji era, in the late years of the 19th and early years of the 20th century in Japan, Marxist theory was not yet widely known. So although maybe the translators, I have not dug into this yet entirely, maybe the translators were still informed by the Marxist background. I mean, certainly some Marxist writings were known in Japan in the late 19th century. But this question of collective identity was related to a view of intellectuals as still connected to the commoners. So in a different way from the Shidafu, the Zhishijieji were somehow seen as a class that had the authority to articulate and spread knowledge, but were connected to, well, the idealized Russian village community, to put it in a word. So they were not cut off from the people. This term, however, became contested with the rise of Marxist writings in China, because, of course, this term of class was problematic in a Marxist context. In the Marxist perspective, intellectuals were not an autonomous class, so calling someone an intellectual class or knowledge class was problematic either in a positive or negative way. It seemed to make the intellectuals both too important as an autonomous class and at the same time to, well, let's say the intellectuals themselves objected to this description. Communist intellectuals increasingly objected to this description because they felt that it depicted them as a kind of privileged class, basically, as rich people, as important people, and so on. So this is when this slogan appeared, 大道知识阶级, so down with the intellectual class. And the term appeared, which is the term that is still dominant today, the term 知识分子, knowledge elements. So if you're not a class, then maybe you are some interspersed elements within various social classes. And in this case, of course, communist intellectuals, especially after the break with the Kuomintang, as underscored by scholars like Vera Schwartz, were eager to 民众化, to integrate with the masses. Nonetheless, in the kind of well, of course, after 1927, the Communist Party was in a very difficult position. But in the late 1930s, the communists regrouped in Yan'an. And in this context, in Mao's theory of new democracy, which he developed around 1939, 1940, there was a role for intellectuals. Or rather, among the four classes that were supposed to take part in the alliance that would bring about the transition of China towards new democracy, one of these four classes was the 小资产阶级, the petty bourgeoisie. And these people are actually the intellectuals. This was Mao's name for the intellectuals. So they had a role in participating in this united front. Although, of course, eventually they would be destined to fade away into the night as socialism would replace new democracy. So after 49, this term, 知识分子, was vastly expanded. To use Eddie Yu's term, who has written the work of reference on this issue, they were reified. Intellectuals were reified to encompass almost any white-collar worker with a secondary education. So after the push towards socialism, the petty bourgeoisie was destined for the trash heap of history, and party intellectuals were only able to survive under the costume of the party cadre, who, following the masked line, was able to draw knowledge from the masses, then rethink and reformulate it as learning material. Deng Tuo, studied by Timothy Cheek, is of course the prime example of this type. So after many years of uncertainty and violent persecution, it was only in 1978 that Deng Xiaoping clearly reaffirmed that intellectuals were part of the working class, and as such had the authority to contribute to production through their expertise. So beyond terminology, I want to discuss the ideal type of intellectuals in the 20th century in somewhat more detail. After the demise of the scholar official, the May 4th intellectual became a kind of cultural trope with lasting influence up to today in China and the Chinese-speaking world. So who were the May 4th intellectuals? They were the people who took part in the May 4th movement of 1919, of course, bringing together both the students born around 1900 and the generation of their teachers who were born around 1880. What brought them together was their self-understanding as a moral and political avant-garde. They were the awakened, the aware. And because of their self-awareness, formulated by Chen Duxiu as 自觉, self-awakening, as opposed to the apathetic masses, they claimed eventually the privilege of tutelage over the unawakened masses. Moral principles continued to play a determining role in this avant-garde role. Moral absolutism and moral superiority in the sense of equality, sincerity, authenticity. These were all of the notions that guided that legitimized the authority of May 4th intellectuals. Science was the model for the production of knowledge, and in connection with this science-centered view, they embraced largely a teleological or Darwinist view of linear historical progress. So it has been repeatedly noted that this ideal was full of internal contradictions. Their moral and cognitive elitism as an avant-garde ultimately legitimated their role in organizing the masses, and for those who joined the Communist Party, legitimated their role in exercising power in the name of the masses. Their embrace of science included a shared imaginary, as I said, of social Darwinism, in which nations that did not adapt to modernity would eventually disappear. So this teleological view in turn exacerbated their moral absolutism. So this absolutism and elitism inherited from May 4th to some extent led to the extreme politicization of the intellectual field in the 1930s and 40s. After 1949, a fracturing of this May 4th ideal took place. So in the PRC, as I said, the Xiaozhichuanjieji were destined to fade away into the dust heap of history. As had already begun during the Yan'an years, the method for achieving this was so-called 改造, re-education, reform of liberal intellectuals, 脱裤子割尾巴, take off your pants and cut off the tail of liberalism. This is what Yang Jiang famously wrote about in her novel, 洗澡. Nonetheless, the reference to May 4th was not entirely lost, as Eddie Yu once again shows. So experts retained a place of privilege in the early years through a kind of bureaucratic Maoist vision of a scientific, rational, and ordered social revolution. Many intellectuals went into exile or emigration into the so-called cultural China, whether in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, or in North America, or even other places. Many of them continued to embrace the May 4th ideal as a form of resistance against the evolution of empirical China. Others rejected May 4th, which they equated with the rise of communism, and preferred to go back to earlier models. But among especially the third force intellectuals who settled in Hong Kong and set up newspapers, worked in universities, of course, there are many prominent examples like Chinese Student Weekly, established by Union Press with US funding in 1952, but also more broad circulation publications like the Mingpao, established by Jin Yong, Louis Cha in 1959, coming, of course, from the Shanghai environment. So in this context, the May 4th ideal still had some force of attraction, including in Taiwan, where liberal scholars were persecuted, like in Haiguang under the White Terror. So this prepared the way for a return of the May 4th ideal Perhaps the earliest of these returns is the one that took place in 1970s Taiwan, as political opposition began to organize, and the journal The Intellectual, 大学杂志, established in the late 1960s, was one of the places that referred very directly to this ideal of the 知识分子, even using this word that was quite, I would say, left inflected in the context of Taiwan. In particular, 大学杂志 was instrumental in advocating the need to end intellectuals' removal from reality and from the broader population. So the journal had a series of issues on so-called modern Chinese intellectuals, 现代中国知识分子. Each of these words is actually interesting. 现代中国知识分子. So, the fact that they referred to these three ideas, modernization, China in Taiwan, and intellectuals as this ideal from May 4th is, of course, very indicative of certain social and political trends that were going on in Taiwan at the time. Ambrose King, the sociologist who was teaching in Hong Kong at the time, but who was Taiwanese or 中华民国人, was active in promoting this ideal of a modernized intellectual who no longer held a monopoly over legitimate knowledge. He even called for what he called in English a new institutionalized intellectual estate. So you see estate here replaces the idea of 阶级. 知识分子 is a little too, maybe too historically inflected, but 知识阶级, of course, will not work either. But the idea of an estate that can provide a counterbalance to state power based on participation in society rather than elite status was very forcefully, very influential at this time. This prepared the way, maybe, if we can follow this kind of reverberation, for the return of the May 4th ideal in mainland China in the 1980s. And of course, it was one of the great references of the student movement in 1989. And I won't go into detail because that would be a whole other discussion. Including in the aspects that had long been criticized of May 4th intellectual models, like moral absolutism, teleological convictions, the certainty that the direction of history was pre-established and that history would lead to a convergence between different political regimes. So it was only after 1989 that marketization and rapid social changes decisively challenged the May 4th ideals. With intellectuals blamed for the failure of the democracy movement, Yu Yingshi's famous article about the marginalization of intellectuals, 知识分子的边缘化, many of them retreated to ivory towers or dived into the sea of commercial endeavors. So the market was embraced as a factor of liberalization in the 1990s, but as a result in the 2000s, this term 公知, which is an abbreviation of 公共知识分子, a translation of the English term public intellectual, became a kind of derogatory word for media intellectuals advancing their own class interests. So in response, appeared what I've described as the 民间 intellectuals, who challenge both the logic of the state and the market, grounding their authority in the margins of society, but also a push for renewed professionalization. And I'd particularly like to point out in Taiwan, the resurgence of this term 知识人, which is, I think, a Japanese word. So at the same time as 知識階級 in late Meiji, there was 知識人, which is intellectual as an individual. But that word, interestingly, didn't come to China in the May 4th era. But at this point, we see it being used more and more as a kind of more neutral professional word to designate intellectuals in an academic context. And the unbreakable link with the state and role as moral conscience of society seems to have finally been decisively called into question. So in the final part of this talk, I want to give an example of what I mean by all of this. So of course, it's very nice to plead for a new approach and to delve into how this term has been constructed and historicize and disaggregate all of the meanings behind this word of intellectual. But what does it actually mean to go beyond the traditional intellectual history? So this is where I want to turn to the question of reading communities, alternative publics, and perhaps civil society, which I've left out of the title because it would be too contentious. Going beyond the traditional intellectual history approach means envisaging new objects and tools. And I think I would single out three that have been particularly prominent in recent scholarship on 20th century China. They are the question of journals and publications, the issue of intellectuals and social movements, and the question of academic disciplines. So I don't necessarily mean that each of these should be published, should be studied separately. Of course, the study of social movements, intellectuals and social movements, has been undertaken for a long time. The study of academic disciplines, of course, this is something we're also very familiar with. Also in the Chinese context, very prominent, 学术史. This has become a kind of alternative to 思想史. What I mean is that in discussing the production and dissemination and reception of ideas, these three tools can help us to move beyond the vision that is overly determined by great individuals and by certain great texts, elite texts. So I want to, in this last part, come back to the May 4th movement, which is, of course, one of the historical and historiographical questions which has preoccupied me for quite a while. For a long time, I would argue that the May 4th movement of 1919 was studied in a way that is maybe best described as schizophrenic. On the one hand, there was a canon of elite texts, often highlighting anti-Confucianism, which were said to be representative of the new intellectuals. So immediately you pull out your anthology and you have, one text by inevitably Chen Duxiu, Li Dazhao, etc. Preferably, intellectuals who evolved towards Marxism. On the other hand, May 4th was studied as a mass social movement based mainly on the ideology of nationalism and protests against the deal reached in the Paris Peace Conference in late April of 1919 over the German interests in Shandong. So this gave rise to the bifurcation, which appeared in contemporary texts, actually, commenting the movement itself, between what was called the New Culture Movement, the 新文化运动, and the May 4th movement, or the 五四运动. So these two ideas have been somehow studied almost in parallel, I would say. So I think this dichotomy can be questioned using the new tools I have outlined above. First, the intellectual manifestos that have now been canonized as these elite texts did not evolve in a void, but rather out of a modern print culture that had been developing since the late Ching and which has been carefully studied by many scholars, including Joan Judge. I would particularly single out her work here. This modern print culture was closely connected to a culture of what can be called peer publications, or 同人杂志, or in Japanese, because that's where this word also came from, doujinshi. This idea that a group of friends would get together and prepare a journal, and everyone kind of played a role both in the material aspects and the intellectual aspects, in the printing, in the binding, in the writing, in the answering letters, in sometimes inventing letters that were sent to the editors and then inventing answers to those letters, and so on. This is what was called a 同人杂志. In particular, in Tokyo, in the last years of the Qing dynasty, until 1908, at least, when the Japanese government, at the request of the Qing court, cracked down on the activities of Chinese exiles. But up to 1908, there was a very lively culture of publication by Chinese intellectuals in Tokyo. Timothy Weston has pointed out the key role played by Tiger magazine, 家印杂志, which is up here, published by Zhang Shuzhao and Chen Duxiu in Tokyo in 1914-15. A journal published in classical Chinese with a very kind of classical sounding title by two intellectuals, two activists, who are generally understood to be on different sides of the new culture divide. Zhang Shuzhao, a conservative, close to the Kuomintang, and Chen Duxiu, the future founder of the Communist Party. To that, I should add that Zhang Shuzhao set up Tiger after leaving the Minli Bao, which was one of the journals set up by the early Kuomintang in the aftermath of the 1911 revolution, edited by Yu Youren. So it was Zhang Shuzhao who recruited Chen Duxiu to set up this more independent liberal alternative to the papers of a still liberal but less and less liberal Kuomintang. So the ideological background to May 4th is much more diverse than is often suggested, with liberal and conservative thinkers playing a comparable role to progressives. And some of Chen Duxiu's famous texts were published in 杂印杂志. Second, intellectuals and the production of knowledge in general have certain connections with social movements. The journals in which new culture thought was elaborated, whether it was the progressive New Youth or the more liberal but often overlooked the Renaissance, 新潮, literally New Tide, these journals were not forums for the discussion of abstract philosophical concepts. They engaged with current events. And in the case of 新潮, they grew directly out of the leadership of the May 4th movement in Peking University, including Luo Jialun and Fu Xinian. So as we've learned from social movement studies, social movements are almost never, as is sometimes imagined, transpositions of philosophical or political abstractions into empirical reality, but rather a complex process of negotiation between contingent events, strategic framing by movement leaders, and more broadly shared ideas by different cohorts or different subgroups of movement participants. So in the case of May 4th, 1919, it would be, of course, incorrect to say that nationalism did not play a central role, but so did many other considerations. In particular, the controversy around Chen Duxiu and Tsai Ying-pei at Peking University, around the controversy around the dismissal of Chen Duxiu, Tsai Ying-pei's retreat to Tianjin, his attacks by the Beiyang government, the Minister of Education, all these issues directly connected to academic freedom, the arrests of students, and ultimately the undemocratic and unaccountable nature of the Beiyang government. This aspect connected with the question of Shandong, in the sense that this same Beiyang government, which ignored the provisions of the 1913 Provisional Constitution to conduct secret parallel diplomacy with Japan, signing away Chinese interests for partisan ends, was seen as unaccountable. So the mobilizations of May 1919 were, of course, related to nationalism, but they were also related to the question of accountability of government and of academic freedom. So these were the issues that ultimately led to, well, spread around China, led to the great strikes in Shanghai, and finally achieved the resignation of 3 ministers, and ultimately the decision of the Chinese delegation in Paris not to sign the Versailles Treaty. As suggested by the sociologists Eiermann and Jameson, I would say that social movements can be seen as producers of knowledge and ideas, as well as of movement intellectuals. So this was the case of May 4th, with the rise of Chen Duxiu, the charismatic dean of the Chinese department at PKU, who was imprisoned for defending his students' rights to demonstrate, more than for the articles he wrote in New Youth, and of the student leaders, one generation younger, Luo Jialun and Fu Xinian. So as underlined in the foundational but still most outstanding study of the May 4th movement by Zhou Cizong, it was after the protests that the intellectual movement was able to fully deploy its potential. So of course, new ideas like science and democracy, Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy, were attractive to certain readers and student participants. But to focus on these abstractions alone, or their Western origins, is somehow to miss the point of what the May 4th movement was about. The May 4th mobilizations legitimized a certain understanding of society in which citizens were seen as having a legitimate say in the affairs of the state. On a theoretical level, this understanding mobilized indigenous articulations as much as it did concepts taken from translations of European or American thinkers. At the same time, it highlighted the conditions of success of such a movement and the inherent limitations of democratic politics in China. By that I mean that the students of PKU realized that they needed support from the population. So that's when they set up student lecture groups that fanned out through Beijing to discuss politics with everyone they met on the street, lecture at street corners, explain the diplomatic situation to ordinary citizens, and encourage them to participate in mobilization. And this mode of intellectual activism is what became a model in the following years. Yes, I'm in the right place. So this is my last slide. In the post-movement era, this impetus developed into two directions, I would say. For political activists, this model led to the establishment of study societies, which were active in bringing together like-minded members, still using this model of the Tongren Zazhi, usually in connection with a journal or maybe a book series, which would bring together the collective knowledge of the group. In these groups, lecturing and disseminating knowledge to the masses, so-called, was always connected with the ideal of investigating society. So this is a particularly interesting point in connection with disciplines, academic disciplines. Groups like the Gongdu Huzhu Tuan in Beijing, the Work Study Mutual Aid Group, which was active around 1919, 1920 under the coordination of Wang Guangqi. Both lectured to the villagers around Beijing and at the same time investigated their living conditions and wrote reports and interviewed them. And this, of course, eventually developed into the social surveys of the 1930s, the Pingmin Jiaoyu Yundong, the mass education movement of James Yen, or the To the People movement, the Dao Minjianqu movement of the early folklorists. A series of such groups were organized around the Young China Society, or Shaonian Zhongguo, which was established in 1918 by Wang Guangqi. So what's interesting about Shaonian Zhongguo is that it was largely structured around Sichuanese native place networks. Of course, it would be nice to see it as a kind of new culture publication that transposed Western concepts and so on. But concretely speaking, that's not at all how it came together. And these Sichuanese networks were in fact transnational. They reached to Paris, to the United States, to Tokyo, where correspondents of this group kept people informed about what was going on. Another similar example studied in Shahar Rahav's really enlightening book, The Rise of Political Intellectuals in Modern China, focuses on Yun Daiying. Yun Daiying was from Wuhan, and he was involved in the Young China Society and the efforts around these collective living experiments in Beijing, and he set up what was called the Li Qun Shu She, the Benefit the Masses bookstore in Wuhan. So this bookstore combined the ideal of communal living, egalitarian self-sufficiency of all participants, and the dissemination of new knowledge by running a communal bookstore that sold new culture publication to students and other people who were interested. So Rahav argues that in this kind of ideal of moral cultivation that goes from the individual to the small group, then to larger networks, and eventually to the creation of nationwide political parties, is not unlike certain traditional ideals of 求生起家治国平天下. All of this to say that the intellectual activities of the 1920s can't simply be summarized in some of these great elite texts of the May 4th canon. The second strain I want to develop of post-movement activities can be described as the middle brow publications. So the dissemination of knowledge did not take place only through morally inspired activist groups, but also through commercial activities. The 1920s saw an exponential rise of general readership periodicals, school textbooks, encyclopedias, works of scientific vulgarization. And as shown by Robert Culp, this impetus was based to a large extent on a small number of commercial publishers based in Shanghai, the most prominent among which was, of course, the commercial press, Shangwu Inshuguan. In this case, too, production and reception were closely connected. And the stratum of petty intellectuals, in Culp's words, who played a central role in producing these publications, they were freelance journalists, copy editors, compilers, school teachers, were also the main consumers of this material. They played a key role in the broader dissemination of new culture ideas from the cities to the rural areas in the 1920s. And this is the argument made by Luo Zhitian in his discussion of what he calls marginal intellectuals. The school teachers who taught sometimes radical ideas to their students in county towns and even smaller villages after they were pushed out of the commercial metropolises. So in this rereading of May 4th, I've tried to emphasize the importance of journals, publications, the networks of readers that form around them, the importance of social movements as moments in which intellectuals engage with concrete social forces and adjust their ideological frames to the contingencies of events. And finally, the importance of academic disciplines, such as the new interest in social surveys or the textbooks that were published by the commercial presses that emerged from the May 4th movement. So I could probably make similar arguments about other examples in the intellectual history of 20th century China, like the reading groups, the underground reading groups in the Mao era, the connection between social movements and the debate on indigenization of social science that took place in Hong Kong and Taiwan in the 1970s. But I will stop here for today and, of course, welcome any further questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sebastian, for this very useful presentation of, let's say, methodological and disciplinary issues, which I also have been very much confronted with. First of all, I mean, when I was trying to grapple with this history of Chinese thought, Histoire de la pensée chinoise, you see, which I published as a result of a teaching experience at in ALCO, the National Institute for Oriental Languages here in Paris. And actually, all the issues that you've been raising and dealing with are issues that, as you said yourself, I mean, appeared in the mainly in the 1970s, while I was a student. You see, that was my student days, and probably you weren't even born or something, you know. And of course,
almost born.
And of course, I mean, these 1970s decade. Actually, I mean, let's say a reflection of the, let's say, the onslaught of Anglophone and especially the US influence in Chinese studies, because, of course, as everyone knows, there was a very radical turn after the Second World War, you know, because before that, Chinese studies were mainly dominated by the European traditions, you see, and especially the French one, in sinology understood as mainly a sort of philological discipline based on, you know, inspired by let's say, the classical studies in Europe, I mean, meaning Greek and Latin. And so mainly textual and philological approach to texts. And what came about after the Second World War is that, first of all, that the Americans, I mean, sort of course, had a dominant position in the world, and of course, I mean, their scholarship and also the number of their publishing houses and academic institutions, I mean, were of course very, very influent. And so all the scholarship that you've been talking about is mainly in English. Of course, I mean, as a representative of the Collège de France, ici, I have to remind you of the 1970s in France, ici, where Chinese studies were still, dominated by, let's say, the philological tradition, embodied by both my masters in Chinese studies, that is Léon van der Merch and Jacques Gernet. Although Jacques Gernet at that time occupied a chair of Chinese social and intellectual history. In fact, it's a rather funny phenomenon that when I chose a title for my chair, I didn't realize that, it was nearly identical with that of my master's, Jacques Gernet, And so they were still very much in that let's say, classical and traditional, let's say, conception of Chinese studies. Although, of course, Jacques Gernet was very much aware of, let's say, the social context. You see, as a historian. Also, when you well, I mean, I think we can be very grateful to you for focusing on these, let's say, first 2 decades of the 20th century, which were indeed, I mean, a sort of really radical turn in the Chinese, let's say, intellectual and scholarly landscape, because, well, I mean, I suppose you were just assuming that everyone listening to you would be familiar with the big historical terms, but it could be useful to recall some of them, and again, I would defend my French colleagues, you see, on this intellectual turn. I think the publications and works of Yves Chevrier, who has been teaching at EHESS for very long years, is absolutely to be recommended. Of course, you mentioned Yingshi, but that's again a sort of more American, reference. But one has to realize that, of course, everybody knows the fall of the imperial system in 1911, and followed by the establishment of the very first republic in the whole of Chinese history by the so-called Sun Yat-sen as a president. But before that, one has to be reminded that just a few years before the whole imperial regime collapsed, in 1905, I mean, you have this very important date of the abolition of the competitive examination system, which had been the backbone of, let's say, the I mean, to be very summary, because we don't have much time, but anyway, the backbone of the whole, let's say, Confucian imperial state system, and significantly enough, I mean, shortly after that, I mean, the whole imperial system collapsed. And 1905, we have to be reminded that it was also the year that the Japanese army defeated the Russian army, so Russia is very much in our, in the news today. But in 1905, Japan, which had been modernized in this Meiji era, which you talked about, managed to after defeating China, managed to defeat the first, let's say, it was the first time that a sort of Far Eastern power, managed to defeat a European power. So that's quite significant. And so then I think you had a very interesting way of focusing on this May 4th, because of course quite a lot of simplifications have been bandied around. You see about this movement, which was always considered to be the very, let's say, foundation of let's say, modern China, and of course you provided a very much more nuanced, you see, vision of that movement, and also the repercussions of this movement down the 20th century. And of course, I mean, you maybe you prefer to not let's say leave aside, I mean, the relationship between the May 4th movement, 1919 and 1989, because of course in 1989 we could see a lot of students, I mean, sort of saying, or 70 years already, 70年了. And I would, well, I mean, if you don't want to sort of deal into this too much, well, it's up to you. But I would, maybe wonder what's become of this heritage of the May 4th movement today, I've been discussing this with my Chinese master in Chinese studies, the Fudan University of Shanghai professor Zhu Weizheng. I mean, all my masters have died now, are dead now, but I owe them quite a lot. And I remember, Professor Zhu Weizheng was he was, very much inspired, you see, by this May 4th spirit. And I was in China just shortly after the fall of the Gang of Four, after the end of the Cultural Revolution, and of course at that time, I mean, the May 4th issue was still very, very hot. I mean, hotly discussed. And so I'd like to, I mean, you to maybe expand on that. And finally, my fad about, the, let's say, the sideway looks, I mean, towards India, And of course, in India, there has been, and there still is, a lot of discussion about what is to be understood by the public intellectual. And of course, I mean, in China, your presentation of the 共知, it's nearly like, I mean, the 公共 is just like the public bus, you see. I mean, and you have the same notion of public, applied to the intellectual, and in a rather, let's say, derogatory sense. Whereas in India, you have a major lady historian like Romila Thapar, who's been still, at age 90 plus, discussing this problem of public intellectual in India. So I don't know whether you want to open this sort of comparative dimension. So, well, that's, these are a few questions just to open the discussion.
Thank you very much. Yes, well, let me respond a little bit. Of course, I won't be able to go into the detail that they deserve, but I want to say a few things. Well, India, if I take them backwards, India, indeed, I mean, it's a really fascinating comparison. I really don't feel I know enough about it to say useful things. But I will reply with another sidestep, which is that there is a lot of work coming, being produced now about the kind of exchanges between China and India in the early years of the PRC. And I think that is very, very interesting in terms of disaggregating certain ideologies that in the PRC tended to be aggregated, but which the Indian interlocutors were in a unique position to disaggregate. So I'm thinking of Brian Tsai's work on the there were some intellectuals traveling back and forth between China and India in the late 40s and early 1950s, and also Arunabh Ghosh's work, a book on statistics. So the PRC's statistical system was set up in the 1950s. And there was a prolonged kind of interest in following India's model, which was ultimately rejected because Mao had his own model of what he. So basically, there was a Soviet view, which was the kind of exhaustive compilation of statistics using counting everything. And there was Mao's view, which was, well, I choose a village in Hunan and I investigate it, and what I say is what is the truth everywhere in China, and if it's not, it will be made to be so. And then the Indian model was using the so-called stochastic tools, so to use samples to produce statistics using quite sophisticated methods to sample population, which was, of course, cheaper and easier, but ultimately seen as somehow suspicious. So that was a very interesting discussion precisely in this area of using disciplines to understand how certain intellectual debates actually take place. Because in some ways, I mean, India inherited this statistical system from the colonial state, and of course, in China also many of the administrations had been controlled by colonial administrators in the Republican era, like the customs, etc. This kind of, so there were statistics that were produced in this way, and ultimately, ultimately this discussion didn't lead to a productive kind of interaction between two anti-colonial, but rather by the imposition of a kind of arbitrary model, I would say. So yeah, on public intellectuals, I mean, I'm a little bit aware of India's kind of interest in this term.
You remember we started discussing this in this seminar that you put up at Reed Hall.
Yes, exactly.
Just before the pandemic started.
Yes, yes, that was February 2020. So, I mean, I wonder whether, because in Europe there are also different traditions, and I think in Japan and in China, this kind of ideal type of the public intellectual doesn't work in exactly the same way. I'm unfamiliar with the kind of discussions about how public intellectuals fit into India's kind of construction of the relations between society and power. But certainly in the British context, I mean, this term that has some British influence in it seems to have been quite successful in India. Whereas, for example, in Hong Kong, I'm thinking this term did not really emerge. So I would argue that there were public intellectuals in colonial Hong Kong, but they were never presented as such. They were professionals or, whatever they were, their professions, journalists, academics, and so on. But they were not presented in that way. So yeah, just some random thoughts to contribute to this discussion. Right. So coming back to 1989 and today, I mean, I do think that there is in some ways, a kind of let's put it this way, there is a global challenge to knowledge and intellectuals. And I think this global challenge that emerged in the post-89 era, and this global challenge, I think, has productive aspects and it has destructive aspects. Well, the destructive aspects, I think, are very easy for us to see, right? The hostility to knowledge, the anti-elite feeling as a political platform, ignorance as a political program, ignoring science, this kind of thing. So this is all very, very, very what is the word I'm looking for? Topical. So, but I do think so. I mean, some of these things appeared. I mean, the Gongzhi, so I used a wrong character, of course. I was joking about wrong characters, so of course I had a wrong character somewhere on the PowerPoint. So it should be the other Gong, right? Gongsi, the Gong. But the Gongzhi, the critique of Gongzhi, I think in some ways is very similar to this kind of agenda because it's also anti-foreign. The Gongzhi are always suspected to be an instrument of, capital, the world conspiracy, color revolutions, George Soros, and so on. So this really reminds us of, other contexts. Nonetheless, I would say that there is also a constructive aspect to this critique of intellectual elitism. The emergence of citizen knowledge is something that has appeared around the world in the area of environmental issues or of gender issues, and really very specialized knowledge that is produced in these citizen movements outside of the framework of the state. And of course, in China, also knowledge on history that is produced in very kind of confidential settings and very unofficial settings. So I mean, certainly there are aspects of the May 4th ideal, and the May 4th ideal, I think, has been too idealized. I think, or
even romanticized.
Romanticized, exactly. I mean, of course, for people coming out of this, the Cultural Revolution, this whole May 4th era would seem like a kind of golden era. And Vera Schwartz's book, which comes out exactly of that moment of interviewing in the early 80s the people who had survived, the last May 4th participants, Zhang Shenfu and so on, bears the stamp of that idealization, I think, to some extent. But I think if we disaggregate May 4th a little bit, I think then it's easier to, use it productively and not simply see it. I mean, I understand the critique of May 4th as an, elitist and, basically the new literati who were trying to speak for the people and confiscate the right to speak. But I'm not sure that entirely captures the May 4th moment. I mean, I think that's a necessary critique. So I would say a similar thing about 1989. Of course, there were all sorts of phenomena in the course of the 1989 movement. But simply dismissing it as a kind of elitist movement that, Wang Hui's reading of June 4th, I think it doesn't capture, some of the most important aspects. For sure, there is this kind of, elite privilege and wanting to speak for certain, values that are maybe not shared by the masses and so on. But there was also a social movement, there were also workers, there were also students, there was a movement in the provinces. It's not all so simple, but of course, if you focus only on a few elite texts, then it's very easy to dismiss them. So that's also why I think this broader social approach can help us to sort of see things a little more clearly, or at least in a more balanced way.
I think I saw one first question appear on the screen. Is everybody, able to read it, or should we read it?
I don't think so.
Yes, I have to read it. Is it? So, very interesting presentation. I'm wondering, for these new culture journals, have you explored the financial print capitalism aspect behind them, i.e., who sponsored those intellectuals and journals? Where did the money come from? What kind of influence did it have on Chinese intellectuals and knowledge production? Thanks.
A very interesting question. So specifically on the new culture journals, there's been a lot of research on this topic. I highlighted this Dojinshi model, this Tongren model, for a reason, which is that many of these journals were produced on a shoestring. They were to some extent self-funded or funded through sales of the journal. Often they were connected to societies, so members had to pay a membership fee to take part in the society, and this fee served to produce the journals. Some of these journals then evolved towards, I would say, intellectual stardom. So in particular, Xinjiang. These journals were then routinely reprinted by some of the commercial presses, like Shangwu or like others. So Xinjiang was circulated at a couple of thousand issues at the time when it was first published. But in the 1920s, there were massive reprints, which can be found, in Kongfu Wang around China now. For example, in Bazin's novel Family, he talks about, trying to buy some of these. The character talks about trying to buy some of these, yearly reprints of Xinjiang and Chengdu, and those were very popular. They were sold in places like the Li Qun Shushe that Dai ran in Wuhan, and so on. So the print capitalism aspect comes in more at the circulation juncture than at the production juncture. In terms of production, those journals were still largely self-contained in a way. In the 1920s, that's a very different story. So the big journals that were published by Shangwu and others, those were clearly the product of print capitalism. They had commercial considerations in their editorial line. There's, for example, a discussion about the place of using classical written Chinese in these journals, and it's seen as an editorial. There's editorial pressure to do away with, to write everything in the vernacular, because that's not so much because people understand it more easily, because the readers actually understand both the same, but because it's seen as more cutting edge. Writing in classical language in the 20s is seen as a bit outdated. So it's not the image that these commercial presses want to give. So that would be, I think, my answer more.
Yeah. So the next question goes like this. This might sound a bit far-flung, but the post-war 1920s was a turbulent decade for many parts of the world. I'm wondering, have you thought of some comparative study between the new culture movement and, say, the fascist movement in Europe? They might sound very different in nature, but I'm wondering, was there, if any, a global structural force behind the simultaneous intellectual cultural movements?
Wow, that's a difficult question.
Yeah. Okay, take your breath.
Not, of course, the new culture movement as such, but the I mean, once again, the New Culture movement provided a model that was much more complex than is often thought. And in particular, within the New Culture movement, there were all sorts of strands, including people who considered themselves to be progressives, but who were then criticized by other prominent members of the New Culture movement as conservatives. Mm-hmm. So this term conservatives, and this is a very good time to point out a really excellent PhD dissertation that I had the pleasure to advise by Emmerich Sue, which is now published in the De Gruyter series on conservatism in modern China, so from the late China to the 1920s. And Emmerich shows very clearly that there are these connections between the May 4th movement and then these groups who evolve towards conservatism, and some of them even close to fascism. I mean, if you go back to the level of individuals, so of course I emphasize structure and all of this, but of course once you go back to the level of individuals, you find some really fascinating stories. Mm-hmm. I mean, people like Dai Zitao he was actually the first translator of the Communist Manifesto before he became a quasi-fascist ideologist for the KMT and very close to Chiang Kai-shek and so on. So there are certainly connections, especially in the style of this kind of activist publication, this kind of group of like-minded people who are, well organized and able to set up a publication and to set up a network and an association and lecture and rent halls and so on. So that is probably part of the equation. But I can't really speak to the fascist movement in Europe. I mean, as far as I understand, that's not exactly how the fascist movement in Europe developed. I mean, so another interesting article, which I didn't talk about because I had no time, by Jan Werner Müller on contemporary history as intellectual history, points out that intellectual history, despite the critique of intellectual history as fostering Cold War liberalism, intellectual history has actually not been eager to investigate totalitarian ideologies. They're usually dismissed as the product of mass politics and unintellectual. Mm-hmm. So he calls for a more kind of a deeper dig into the intellectual components of totalitarian ideologies. Mm-hmm. Of course, that doesn't mean that totalitarian regimes are entirely the product of an ideological corpus. I mean, that would be this idealistic fallacy. But there is perhaps a need to come back also to, I mean, in connection with all of the social and political history of totalitarian regimes or fascism, to come back to the ideological aspect. So thank you for the question, and I will further investigate.
Yeah, well, if I may add just a few words. I mean, since you talked about one of your former doctoral students who's now one of our colleagues, actually, I happened to supervise a doctoral dissertation by Joseph Ciodo, who at that time was working on Zhang Junmai. And is now very much interested in what was meant by the word 文化, this binome 文化 in the 1920s and 30s. And so I'm just calling your attention to work to come. And I think if you read these dissertations, you will realize that it's not so much a matter of let's say on the one hand, the fascist movements in Europe, and then, whatever can be called the equivalent in China. I think you have the whole range. And as you pointed out, Sebastian, let's say the label conservative, I mean, could mean anything, because I mean that's the kind of label that you would you know, stick on your anyone who wouldn't agree with you. You know, that's you know. And so I think it's worth delving into this question, but maybe in a more you know, sort of nuanced and based on facts, you know, approach. Yeah. No more questions. So is there any other aspect that you'd like to expand on? I think you've very much, you know, sort of covered the whole ground. I mean, you know, of course now it's the whole question is what do we do with all this? You've talked a lot about the 20th century, but well, what about the present century? You know, is it that we are going through another series of radical turns, or where are we heading to? That's,
yeah, I mean, the crisis of public discourse, I mean, maybe not even using the public sphere. I mean, Habermas recently published a new essay on the crisis of the public sphere in the context of current events. But even if we decide to abandon this concept of the public sphere that has been so widely criticized, but the crisis of public discourse, I would say, is certainly an object of concern, I think, for anyone who is interested in intellectuals. Intellectuals and public discourse are almost the same object, I would say. I mean, once you move past individualities, I mean, there are colleagues who suggest study a sociology of public interventions, for example. This kind of, I mean, that's very close to, I think, in content to what intellectuals actually do. So it does seem that to some extent there is a global crisis of public discourse, which is related probably to many factors, and it's probably still very early days to really try to surmise or to hypothesize about its reasons. But I'm really worried that if I continue speaking, I will really sound like a cultural conservative. So my May 4th friends will, you know, like Chen Duxiu will no longer talk to me. So I think I will stop there.
Okay.
And I mean, I think, but of course, this is an interesting object of study also for us. I mean, the conditions for the existence of public discourse and why those conditions seem to have disappeared. You know, to what extent are they related to changes in material infrastructure, in the structure of capitalism, the structure of the media landscape, the issue of, you know, virtual discussions and so on. So how do the technical changes, the changes in the economic structure, and also the political changes, how do they all connect, and how do they appear in the background? Yesterday, I was listening to a book talk by Joseph Escherich, presenting his new book on Yan'an, the accidental paradise of the Chinese Revolution. And accidental, he means in the sense of that no one really thought they would end up in Yan'an. There was no real reason for Mao to set up his headquarters in Yan'an. But he said, when there's a car accident, it doesn't mean there is no cause. An accident means there is no immediate determination, but there are always reasons.
Yes, of course.
So I'd say the crash of public discourse also has its reasons.
Yeah, certainly. Maybe since we still have some time, for those who haven't yet read your very good book on the Minjian grassroots intellectuals, could you make a brief presentation of that recent book of yours?
I will. I mean, I can. I maybe I don't want to, you know, bore people too much with. Although, of course, the crisis of public discourse also means that you could just hit the off button.
Yes, exactly.
But I think in connection with what I'm saying today, I did try in this book against the background. I mean, in some ways, I considered the issue of intellectuals throughout the 20th century, but so much has been written about that that it's really very hard to say something new about intellectuals throughout the 20th century. So I ended up focusing on this very end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century, which is the only moment where I really felt I had something to contribute that hadn't already been written 10 or 20 times. So. But what I was trying to do was somehow, I think, related to this project, which is focusing not on, you know, canonical texts or even texts coming from academia or from, you know, authoritative media, journals, or publications, but trying to find texts that circulate in more confidential settings that are somewhat below the radar, that are that tell us different things about Chinese society and that build up knowledge in a different way. So as I was saying, the knowledge about history, about the Mao era, for example, which is still a difficult object in official academic institutions, although there are some colleagues working on that in China. Knowledge about Chinese society, that too, I mean, of course, there are now, again, sociology departments after they were closed for many decades, but still these sociology departments are very much in the throes of Marxist methodology. It's very difficult to take a kind of different approach. So often you find attempts that are maybe unacademic, they are maybe, you know, unpersuasive, but they have insights into Chinese society that are not necessarily easy to find in academia. So this was the kind of thing I became interested in, and of course that for me raised the question of to what extent this Mintian model can be projected backwards. You know, if we have maybe overemphasized the kind of role of these state-condoned intellectuals throughout the 20th century. So that's maybe a little bit what's in the background of this talk also.
Well, so I think well, you're all encouraged, I mean, to read this book, and I think it's time to really thank you again, Sebastian Veg, for this very informative and remarkable talk, which I think I in the first place, I mean, learned a lot. And let me remind you that the next session will be on Tuesday, April 12th, with Philippe Urfalino from EHESS, who is going to give a talk apparently in English, but the title is in French, Les enjeux politiques de la réflexion sur la décision majoritaire. And the discussant will be Charles Girard de l'Université de Lyon 3. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.